Díobh go léir cóide agus tá fáilte rót. Welcome to Be My Guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, Clare's Wish Foundation in Limerick, and Deal Animal Rescue in West Limerick. Otto Fritz Meyerhof was born in Hanover at Theaterplatz 16A, the son of wealthy Jewish parents. In 1888, his family moved to Berlin, where Otto spent most of his childhood and where he started his study of medicine. He continued these studies in Strasbourg and Heidelberg, for which he graduated in 1909 with a work title, Contributions to the Psychological Theory of Mental Illness. In Heidelberg, he met Hedwig Schallenberg. They married in 1914 and became parents of a daughter, Bettina, and two sons, Gottfried, who referred after emigration to himself as Geoffrey, as well as Walter. In 1912, Otto Meyerhof moved to the University of Kiel, where he received a professorship in 1918. In 1922, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine with Archibald Vivian Hill for his work on muscle metabolism, including glycolysis. In 1929, he became one of the directors of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research, a position he held until 1938. Escaping the Nazi regime, he emigrated to Paris in 1938. He then moved to the United States in 1940, where he was appointed a guest professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I'm really honored today that his grandson, David Meyerhof, is coming on the show to talk to me about both he and welcome David Meyerhof to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be part of this program.
Indeed, I think the honor is ours. I mean, I said at the interview, at the introduction of this about your grandfather, Otto. It's an amazing story. I mean, particularly given that by my calculations, he was only 38 when he received the Nobel Peace or the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. It's extraordinary. The life he led. Could you maybe take us back to the beginning of Otto Meyerhof's life and tell us his story and your subsequent story?
Yes. Well, for one thing, I never knew him because he passed away when I was almost 1 year old, and that's one thing that I truly miss, that my actually knowing him personally, so I could gather information from my father and also from many other sources, because there are at least right now 3 books about him, and there's an author named Andrew Brown, who's in the process of writing the story of Otto Meyerhof, and A.V. Hill, because A.V. Hill from England shared the Nobel Prize with him. So they were actually friends and colleagues in study for many years before they both received the Nobel Prize. So they had a very close connection, which it's, to me, also kind of a wonderful idea that, okay, so Germany and England, you know, these two science representatives of their country were very close and worked very close together. I do know that Otto was born into an upper middle class family. His father was a factory owner in clothing, I think, manufacture of clothing. And he was born in Hanover, Germany, and just less than a year ago, a plaque was put on the building where he was born.
Yeah.
And they actually had a real nice ceremony. I wasn't able to go, but there were relatives.
Did you not get to it?
No.
No.
It,
COVID.
Well, there's a number of reasons, but yeah, that's part of it. But so they're very proud of him. But one thing I was able to do was in approximately 2001, the Otto Meyerhof Medical Center was opened, and
That's fabulous.
I was able to attend the opening. So we actually had 25 relatives from 5 countries at the opening. And, you know, I know I'm really supposed to be talking about his life, but it's a reflection of his life.
It contributes to making Otto Meyerhof the person he was. He grew up in Berlin, but you know, he was born in Hanover, as you said. But you know, it all goes to making him the man he was. You know.
Yes, I mean, I know when he was 16 years old, he had like a breathing disease. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he had to go to Egypt to get the more dry air. And he actually went with his cousin, who was Max Meyerhof. And Max Meyerhof was an ophthalmologist who also was an expert in Arabic studies. And so together they took a 3-month voyage, and that's actually a book about the diary of their travels. So just on the sideline, what's interesting is Max Meyerhof gave his services free to the people of Egypt. And ophthalmologist, he was one of the top ophthalmologists. And when he passed away, there were literally thousands and thousands of people at his funeral. So that's just a highlight. But getting back to Otto Meyerhof Medical Center, which is in the University of Heidelberg, and it's actually right now, the series of lectures in his name is going on as it's reaching the 100th anniversary of him receiving the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology. So, like I said, in 2001, I was able to go to the opening, and what that medical center is, it's dedicated to curing diseases. So every laboratory is different. There's a laboratory of diseases of the eye, diseases of the nose, diseases of the mouth, diseases of the nose, diseases of the ears. So each part of the body, there's a different laboratory finding cures for the diseases of that part of the body. So that's kind of showing the impact of my grandfather on medicine, because so when I went there, actually I was able to go a second time because the mayor of Heidelberg allowed Holocaust survivors to go for a week, all expenses paid. And this is true for most of cities in Germany, where they reach out to survivors. So it was my father, but my father had passed away. So I asked if I could go, and they said yes, and you can bring one other person. So I brought my son, and that was about 12 years ago. Yeah. And that was where we got to go down Meyerhof Strasse. For one thing, there was a date. See, so there's Meyerhof Street.
Oh, you've made it when there's a Strasse called after you.
Yeah. And the end, you go through a forest, and at the end of it is the European Molecular Biological Laboratory, this huge building which has research and classes and so on. So, but then also I was able to go, there was a professor who knew so much about my grandfather, was helping sponsor the opening and other things. And so he went with my son he invited my son and I to his office, you know, and we sat in his office, and he said, "Here, I want you to have something," and he gave me a copy of Otto's thesis for his PhD, 1910,
Wow.
which was actually about
physiological theory.
Mental health, the study of mental health. And so that was originally kind of what he was looking at, but then he went into more the physical part of physiology and medicine. And then I just got to tell you one little story, because we went out to a restaurant and for dinner, and then it started to rain, and just, oh, we got to go inside. And so there were all these wooden benches, but it was a very beautiful restaurant. And so we started to sit down. He said, no, don't sit there. Sit here. That's where your grandfather sat when he would meet people.
Isn't that lovely?
That was so.
But you know,
nice.
David, isn't it lovely when you can go back retrospectively and look at the reverence that your ancestor was treated with, whether it's in Egypt or Germany, and you can see the impact that your close ancestor, your grandfather, just 2 generations away from you, had on the community, not just on the community, but on medicine itself for generations. I mean, his name will live in history now for the work he did. You know, some of us can only hope that we will make an impact in one person's lives, but he's made an impact on generations of scientists and doctors who are studying his theories, and will continue to study his theories for centuries to come.
That's very nice. Yeah, we actually got to go into the Max Planck Institute, and there were scientists who were continuing his work and knew intimately about him. So my son and I were walking, and there was a German TV station that actually followed us into the laboratory. I got to go into my grandfather's laboratory. So I said, so when did he work? And they said, he never stopped working. And then it was like a window he could see out, and it was a field. And so that's, and then they were talking about ATP. Well, I can't really pronounce the whole long word, but ATP is the fundamental process of life. And it was discovered by Lohmann, and Lohmann was a student of my grandfather. So Lohmann did not receive a Nobel Prize for that, which he should have. But so in high school, biology, chemistry, in all biochemistry, you have to study ATP. You have to know what ATP is if you're going to be a nurse or a doctor, or go into other fields like that. So so Otto also was instrumental in that, but his was, it's called the Emden Meyerhof Parnas pathway, EMP pathway, right, which is glycolysis. And glycolysis is the conversion of glucose, which comes from sugar, into energy. So he basically discovered how sugar is converted to energy in the human body.
And ATP is adenosine triphosphate.
Yeah, you can say it.
I can say it. I haven't a clue what it means. I do. I do. My limited biology in school, for Leaving Cert here in Ireland, which is our final year before you go to college. And it's the final exam, but you do biology or science, of course, in school. But Otto was the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medicine in 1929, prior to the outbreak of World War II. And from what my research tells me, he moved very fortuitously Prior to the onset of Nazism, he moved to France. And then at the outbreak, he moved to Spain, and from there to America.
Well,
it's just,
it's actually, I know the way you say it, you know, that he moved, but it was actually very complicated and
I know,
very dangerous.
I understand that all that,
I know.
They were I suppose they were the geographical destinations to which he found himself prior to and during World War II. And one could say he was very fortunate that he actually took that step at the time that he did to get out of Germany. Because had he waited maybe another year,
he couldn't have. Yeah. Well, because what it was, you know, Kristallnacht occurred about November 3rd, 1938. But he had already made preparations before that to escape and to leave. But just to familiarize your audience with Kristallnacht was the night of the broken glass, when the Nazis came and smashed the windows of every Jewish establishment, every business, essentially synagogues, schools, homes, and they beat up every Jewish person walking down the street, whether they were 9 years old or 90 years old, it didn't matter. And so there was so much glass on the ground, it looked like crystals. So it was called Kristallnacht. And so it was a signal, really, if you were Jewish and you were still in Germany, whatever you could do is to get out.
Many didn't, though.
Many were not able to.
Many didn't. Many saw what was happening as something that would eventually pass, and that they just didn't see the dangers. Some people just don't see the dangers, or they're more positive about things. Your grandfather, Otto, was, I suppose, it's not that he was intelligent enough, because there were many intelligent people who didn't see it coming, but there was something in him that actually saw what was going on and thought, no, I'm getting out of here. This is it.
Yes. Well, what you said is really true, that actually the vast majority of Jews did not think that the Holocaust could happen.
No.
You know, and there are many reasons for that, but in his case, focusing more on that, actually, you know, Hitler came to power in 1933, so that was that's the beginning of the Holocaust, because first he started putting political opponents in concentration camps, which Dachau was the first, and the first opponents were communists and socialists, and so they were at least 50,000 put into concentration camps, because actually the Nazis knew that these were the strongest opposition to their reach for power, and so they wanted to get rid of them first. But in terms of you know, then the Nuremberg laws passed. And so with my grandfather, in 1935, all Jews in Germany were deprived of civil rights. And on December 31, 1935, Otto Meyerhof lost his professorship at Heidelberg University. He was allowed to continue as director of the Institute of Physiology at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. So what I have all these documents that my father had kept. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of pages, maybe 500 to 600 pages. And one of them is, to me, which I only recently uncovered, is like a questionnaire that they gave to Otto. And what it said, and this is all in German, so I don't really completely understand it, but what I do understand is they put in the answer. So it says name, address, so on. And then it says Jüdische, so Jew. Then the next answer, Jew. The next answer. So it goes on for a whole page, Jew, 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 Jew. And then at the end of it, it says, you're dismissed from your professorship at Heidelberg University of Heidelberg.
And the thing about it was that the Nazi Party generally installed their own teachers and lecturers who were trained in the Nazis' philosophical views, if you can call them that, and they put them in so that they could further teach, because Hitler had this idea that you know, to aim at the youngest in society was the best, because if you get children very, very young, you have them for the rest of their lives. And that's why I suppose it was imperative for him and the Nazis to have people in the education system who were going to further the Nazi propagandist views. And people like your father, or your grandfather, I should say, were opposed to those views, obviously. And you are quite right. The very first people to be imprisoned were the political dissidents. And after that, I mean, there's a wonderful poem by Reverend Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the communists. And
that's what I wanted to read towards the end.
Huh? Yeah, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a communist. And then finally they came for him, and then finally they came for the Jews, and there was I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And finally they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
Right. That's I'm a Holocaust speaker. I think I mentioned. So I go to high school students, I go to middle school students, schools. I'm actually the Holocaust speaker coordinator for the Glendale Unified School District here in Southern California, and the Los Angeles Unified School District. So I worked with 10 Holocaust survivors who were speakers, 5 of whom were in concentration camps. And so I've been doing this for at least 6 years. And we've gone to dozens and dozens of schools throughout Southern California and been very successful. So what you just said is something that I always read at the end of the program for the students to think about, for them to understand what that means, you know, the significance of that it, even though it was written, many years ago, it applies to today too. It's very, very important.
David, that's what I was going to ask you. How important do you think, because I suppose it's a leading question, because I have my own answer, which is that it's of utmost importance that education, Holocaust education, is being taught. I did my doctorate on literature about childhood under Nazism.
Amazing.
And I've been interviewing survivors and children of survivors and people working like yourself, working in the area of Shoah studies. And I have a full YouTube channel with all of the interviews on them so far. But I just think people say to me, I meet it all the time, why are you talking about the Holocaust? It happened years ago and years ago. But I think it's the genesis of life, really, of what's happening today. Because if you don't understand what happened during World War II, if you don't understand what led up to Kristallnacht, led up to the Kindertransport, led up to the transport camps, the transit camps, the death camps, the concentration camps, you're destined to repeat it again. And we can see it today with the rise of what I see is not just xenophobia. There's xenophobia of all nationalities, but particularly, it has to be said, anti-Semitism. It's, for me, it's frighteningly on the rise. And I think education on Holocaust studies should be in every school,
Yes.
every country.
Yeah.
Because it's the only way we're going to learn not to repeat what happened and to see the signs.
Right. Well, so in Germany, it's required Holocaust for every student, and every student has to visit a concentration camp. That's part of their curriculum, and also it's illegal to say Heil Hitler. It's illegal to display the Nazi flag in Germany. So what I've said to people, I've said, so in Germany, there's an understanding, and with the young people especially, of not repeating what happened in that country. But what about the rest of the world? Why is it not illegal to promote Nazism? Because Nazism is the same thing as promoting a death-making organization. It should be illegal. But if you don't mind, I wanted to go into a little bit of my father's story, because it illustrates life under Hitler.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I just, because he wrote his autobiography, I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Hitler came to power in 1933. When a teacher entered the classroom, we had to stand up and give the Nazi salute, saying Heil Hitler. I just moved my lips and did not say anything. By the end of 1933, a Hitler youth group had formed at our school. One very tall boy, whom I still recognize from a class photo, was their leader. He asked me why was I at their school, and that they would beat me up in gym class if I continued coming to their school. I felt terrorized, and I turned to my older brother. He said he could not help me. In music class, I kept singing my part of the song at the wrong time. The teacher got so mad, he came up to me and slapped my face so hard that my nose started bleeding. When my parents complained to the principal the next day, he indicated he was powerless because the music teacher was a member of the Nazi Party. So my father went to college in Paris, France. He actually started college when he was 16. He went to Dulwich College in England, and then studied and went to Paris. But during that time, the French implemented the surrender on demand policy, where all Germans had to turn themselves into authorities, regardless if they were Jewish or not. And of course, it was mostly German Jews who had to turn themselves in. So all males 17 to 65, all females 17 to 56 had to assemble on May 15th and bring with them a blanket, clothing, and food for a few days. And all the males in Paris had to assemble in a sports stadium. Soon the toilets overflowed, and the situation became inhumane. I was assigned to an army camp in Chamberan. I remember that a soldier hit me in the face because he thought I did not climb into the bus quickly enough. The village was 300 miles south. We had to march. We were told we could only march at night because German fighter planes were strafing the roads in France when they saw moving objects. I had a constant fear that a German army unit would overtake us, and that I would end up in a German concentration camp. If I had a document that showed that I was Jewish, my German passport had a large J stamped on it. After a couple of nights of marching and thinking about it, I threw it into the bushes, not foreseeing the difficulties my new statelessness would cause me in the future. Even though he felt that way, it actually was a problem later. After 3 nights of marching, the group arrived at the village of La Chalard, where the officer requisitioned the village school and turned it into a detention camp. There, my father noticed the gate in the back of the school was unguarded, and he decided to venture out into the local vineyards. No one bothered him. So he started doing this, and you'll see drawings, a part of the PowerPoint that's at the end. Those are my father's drawings on that march. what he saw, and he was able to draw with pencil. And he had his mother was an artist. So Otto's wife, Hedvig, was a mathematician and she was an artist. She started college when she was 17 as a woman.
Both sides of her brain were working. The creative side and the mathematical side. It's amazing. I envy people who have the mathematical side. You taught, am I correct in saying you taught mathematics?
Well, I taught middle school math and science to sixth grade students. And I always was very big on the science part of it. And actually, my former students have attended or are still attending 39 universities across the United States. I have students who graduated from Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and we keep in touch through Facebook.
My book is in those colleges. My book on the Holocaust is in Stanford and it's in Yale. So I'm proud of that, actually, I have to say.
That's really great.
That's about the only part of me that got into Stanford or Yale was my book.
Well, that's fantastic. If I could just, is it okay if I just continue?
Sure.
So every day after lunch, the sergeant bellowed out the names of the 70 inmates. When he called Meyerhof, a voice answered present, except it was not my voice, and that of my painter friend, Max Kaiser, whom I had asked to answer for me. I was already at the train station, having taken the bus from the village early in the morning, and I had escaped by an unguarded gate in the back of the village. My father made his way to Hotel Splendide in Marseille, where his parents had taken a room. That was where his parents would meet Varian Fry, the man who would rescue them and their son along with 2,000 other Jews. Varian Fry was the American Shindig. Yeah. And they told my father my parents said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I escaped." They said, no, you have to go back because we're getting forged documents to get you out. So my father had to go back and into the camp. And you're going to see those documents. And actually, I mean, this one is the forged document that arrived about 3 weeks later after he got back to camp. So he could get out legally because otherwise they would go looking for it, you know.
Like it reminds me of the movie. I don't know if you ever saw it, Escape to Victory, where what's his name had to Sylvester Stallone, who was one of the characters, escaped the prison, and he had to go back in. And he said, "Are you insane? Why do I have to go back?" And they said, "You've got to go back because you've got to help bring them a message to the rest of the prisoners that we're on our way to help them and to help them to all escape together." He had escaped on his own, but he was going back in to help the rest of them to escape via a football match in Cologne, in Paris. So that's amazing. I always find that part of the movie amazing. And now your grandfather had to do the same.
My father.
Father, I mean.
Yeah, had to do the same in real life. But so then,
wow.
You know, Varian Fry asked my father to, at that time, to find a path over the Pyrenees to as a way to help people escape. So my father was 18 at that time, and he was in contact with Lisa and Hans Fitko. This was a couple who had already escaped through Czechoslovakia and like 5 other countries. Anyway, and so they were trying to escape. So they went with him, and they pretended like they were going on a hike for a picnic with a backpack, and they kept walking, but all of a sudden, after after a whole day of hiking, 2 French policemen came out of the woods and asked us, what were we doing so close to the border? They asked for identification and saw that we were Germans. Since I spoke better French than the Fitkos, I said that we lived nearby and we were just hiking. They said they did not believe me and they would take us to the gendarmerie in Survey. I pleaded with them to let us go, that we were German refugees and wanted to get to Spain to escape the Gestapo. You can tell that to our lieutenant. Come with us and don't try to escape or we'll shoot you. That's what they said. It took half an hour to reach the police station. The lieutenant was completely unsympathetic and said, we're going to take you to court on Saturday. You can tell your story to the judge. We were taken to the prison cells and there were piles of straw. And for the evening meal, we were given a piece of black bread and something they called coffee. We had not eaten since lunchtime. That night was the one time in my life I prayed to God to save me. I was sure the judge would have us jailed and I would end up in the hands of the Gestapo. Around noontime, the police took us to a restaurant. This was France. And you know, they have to have lunch in a restaurant. I mean, it doesn't matter that, you know, this is going on. So I recognized the same customs officer with whom my father and I had talked to a couple of weeks earlier. He sat at another table. Since we were under guard, I could not go to him, but I had an idea. Public toilets in France lack toilet paper. So just before leaving Banyuls, I had stuffed toilet paper into my back pocket. It was very stiff. Turning away from the guard, I wrote on the piece of toilet paper, please contact my parents and tell them we've been jailed. On Saturday, we will be taken before the judge in Perpignan. Our meal was soon over, and as we left, I crumpled up the paper, threw it on the ground, looking at the customs officer and gesturing at the paper. On Saturday morning, we were driven to the court. I was completely overwhelmed when I saw my parents there. While waiting our turn, they told me the customs officer had brought them the piece of toilet paper. They immediately went to see the mayor. He phoned the judge, whom he knew. They were both members of the Socialist Party, which was anti-Nazi, and told him our story. When our case came up, the policeman explained that the Fitkos and I had been caught close to the border, trying to leave France illegally without visas. The judge said to the policeman, thank you for your presentation, and turning to us, he said, you can go. It was unbelievable.
You know, I think listening to that story and listening to the story about Otto and the research I've done on him, fortune seems to have followed, good fortune in many cases seems to have followed the Meyerhofs, certainly Otto and your dad, because the right people were there at the right time to give support, whether it was emotional support or support in finding work or getting out of countries and into other countries, or even the simple fact of having the right mind to actually realize when you're in danger and it's time to leave. That's always very difficult when you have a home and you love the place you live in, but you're seeing the dangers around you and you're trying to decide, is it time to leave everything I've known all my life and move to another country, or will it get better?
Right. So, I mean, going back to like Otto, the Nazis had a campaign against him. You know, he was one of the most prominent scientists in all of Germany, you know, and having the Nobel Prize. I mean, there were other Nobel Prize winners who were also prominent, but one thing is that my grandfather protected his staff. They were all Jewish. He would not let them be taken away. And they were 2 who were communists who were put in jail, and my grandfather, got them out. And the Nazis knew this, and so they were writing, for example, there's evidence not only of scientific, but also political context, which he has with foreign countries. Therefore, Professor Meyerhof is highly dangerous, and an offer for an appointment abroad is an ideal opportunity to get rid of him. This was in 1935 by the Nazi Teachers Organization. And then the Heidelberg Nazi Party organization wrote, it would be unacceptable for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute to come even temporarily under the leadership of a Jew. The documents speak against Professor Meyerhof, unfortunately cannot be substantiated because Meyerhof's staff refuses to bear witness against him because nobody would say anything about him. But then in November 29th, 1938, three weeks after Kristallnacht, my grandfather was dismissed as director of the Institute of Physiology. But he had actually planned a vacation, quote unquote, into Switzerland before that. And what he did the day before escaping, he set up an experiment, very elaborate, beautiful experiment. And the next day he disappeared. So he was thinking ahead, but this was very difficult because he had to escape by foot over the Pyrenees, along with Hedwig, his wife, and Hedwig. They had to take off their shoes to be quiet. So she could not, there were rocks and everything. And so she had to be carried by a third person who was actually the mayor of the town, carried over on his back over the Pyrenees. And then they came to the border of Spain, where most people who came were turned back. If you were turned back, it meant concentration camp, essentially. So they were to go to a hotel. All they could carry was a small handbag. There were 2 or 3 other persons in my parents' party. They had to go single file. The guide showed them the way to the Spanish border control house and left them. It was early in the morning. The Spanish border officers were extremely arrogant and generally returned people to France if they did not have a French exit visa. People without Spanish visas were jailed. On that Sunday, my parents had to wait in line. Everybody was returned to France. By pure coincidence, though, again, here it is, an American vice consul was passing through Spain in his car and happened to stop at the border. My mother begged him to influence a Spanish officer, and the vice consul did what he could. When my parents were called in to the officer, he refused to let them pass. This is my father's writing, he's quoting him. When my parents were called into the officer, he refused to let them pass. In fact, he refused 20 times. While my mother insisted in invoking all the arguments from the United States to the Nobel Prize. Then suddenly the officer said they could pass. My parents went to Barcelona by train, and then from Madrid, they flew to Lisbon and sailed on October 16th, 1940, arrived in New York, October 25th. And Otto was offered a position by the Rockefeller Foundation at the University of Pennsylvania. He went on to make more discoveries. And
David, sorry for interrupting you. That actual position was manufactured specially for Otto in Pennsylvania. That actual position didn't exist. They actually created it specifically for your dad in the university. Such was
grandfather.
his
Grandfather.
fame.
Yeah.
Your grandfather. Did I say your father? Grandfather.
I know. But, and so Otto actually wrote about 400 papers in his lifetime. So I've asked people, if you've ever heard of a scientist writing 400 papers? I don't, I mean, he collaborated on many of them. My cousin actually has all the papers, leather bound. He lives in Sonoma, California. Yeah. So there is a record of and a list of all. So when he came to the United States, he wrote at least 40 papers in the United States and continued his work, mostly in Woods Hole in Massachusetts. But I do, I'm a poet besides, and so I wanted, if it's okay, I wanted to read the poem to my father. My father toward the end of his life, had Parkinson's. And the last 2 years of his life, um, he suffered quite a bit. And I wrote poems. I actually have a book of poetry, which has 60 poems.
Poetry. I absolutely love poetry. Actually, during in my book, I put a lot of poems by Micheál O'Shiel, who's an Irish. He was the first Roman Catholic professor of English and English poetry at Trinity College in Dublin, and he wrote several books on the Holocaust, called The Gossamer Wall. And they are the most extraordinary pieces of poetry. And I used several of them in my thesis. And I always used opening epigraphs of poetry, because I always found them a nice way or a nice segue into a chapter. Because when you look at the Holocaust and you look at the children that survived and the people that survived, many of them survived through writing poetry, creating art. Like Peter Giddens, who said you could, even in mud and scum, beauty can be created through poetry and through art. You can make beauty out of even the most ugly of situations. And I think that's probably why I love poetry. Poetry has a way of making something absolutely awful beautiful.
That's true. I've been writing poetry since I was little, actually, but so in my book, half my poems are about my father. Actually, the last 2 months of his life, I woke up every night at 3 o'clock and wrote a poem, and then I went back to sleep. But if it's okay with you to read, this is a poem to my father after he passed away. This was in 2006. Is the rain washing away the tears, or is it creating more tears? Are we breaking our hearts or having our hearts broken? Down the gullies, through the forest, washing, taking away our sorrows. Do we know what we see, hear, taste, smell, or touch? Can we be part of this beautiful world, or must we carry this heaviness throughout our lives? Are we facing in reality in front of our faces, or are we running from what will catch us in the end? Life is as precious as every single drop of rain, every grain of sand, every star in the sky, every leaf on the tree, and every soul on this planet.
That's absolutely beautiful, David.
And so,
what were you thinking at that particular moment when you wrote that poem? What were you thinking?
Well, about life, that life is so important, that it's more important than everything in the world. And we have to do whatever we can to preserve life. But with my father, I knew he was slipping away. And so I always felt like I had to write what I was feeling, like it was either one way or the other. And I was fighting my own battle for his life too.
Yeah. Essentially. You find it cathartic writing poetry?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, every emotional period of my life, essentially I write poems when there's suffering or something wrong, but it's not just that, it's in the world too. I write about the world also, because to me, we're all connected in a certain way. And I truly believe if there's one person suffering anywhere in the world, that we need to feel that, and we need to say something about it if I can. And so when I try to write, I try many times to make it universal and understood
Is that why the Martin Niemöller quote or the Martin Niemöller poem has such a resonance with you as it does with me? The importance of standing up when you see an injustice being done to any person, even if they don't share your ethnicity, your culture, your language, your religion, because eventually, if it's done to them, it will be done to you.
Yes, and so my grandfather.
That poem means so much to you because you are a sensitive soul, conscious of the pain of other people's suffering.
Well, my grandfather did not hesitate to speak out, Otto Meyerhof, and he, when he wrote, my grandfather wrote poetry also, and I'm just finding some more of his poems. It's almost 90% in German. There's very few in English. So that's one thing. And of course, the problem when you translate, you can lose something from the poem.
Yes, absolutely.
But I just want to say that he wrote this letter to a woman named Mina Specht. And this was in 1943, in the middle of the war, World War II. Mina Specht was a woman who was the leader of the women's movement in Germany. She was an anti-Nazi, she was a socialist, and she edited a newspaper, which later on Otto actually helped edit for a period of time. But something that he wrote in the letter, I was able to get translated. I got the whole letter translated, but it was a long letter. But what he said is, distinguishing between Germans and Nazis is in itself a propaganda lie. I know what all or 90% of the professors did in 1933 when their Jewish colleagues, whom they themselves had appointed, were deprived of their rights and made homeless. And the same thing occurred in all academic circles and all levels of society, except in certain areas of the church. Maintained their cowardly silence or even satisfaction, and not even 1% of the professors were party members. In the same fashion, broad sections of the population, though overall a somewhat smaller percentage, were willingly served as slaves and helpers to the tyrants, even helping as torturers and executioners. It doesn't help that a powerless minority kept their hands clean, or that hundreds of themselves became martyrs to the strength of their convictions, if hundreds of thousands turned into murderers. It would have been physically impossible for 5 million Jews, 89% of all the Jews in the countries Germany occupied, 10 million Russians, Polish, Serbian, and other civilians, to be killed by a few Nazi criminals. Hundreds of thousands were necessary for this. A people without any sense of morality were behind these mass murders.
Yeah, I agree 100%, David. I absolutely agree 100%. It took much more than a group of Nazis to commit the atrocities that were committed. It took people sitting back reticently, saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter. That's none of my business. I'll say nothing. I'll be quiet. I'll mind my own business." I know it's very easy to say, but it took people turning against their own neighbours and seeing the neighbours that were friends at one time now as enemies because of the fact that they happen to be Jewish or gay or socialists or politically opposed to the Nazis with a different view. And I worry nowadays that the same thing is happening, that people who have different political views, different social views, societal views, are being silenced because of those views. I think it's very important nowadays to hold on to the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of speech within an education system. Nowadays, you're hearing people, because they believe in one thing or they don't believe in another ethos, they're being fired from schools or asked to leave or not called because they're Jews to give lectures in colleges and things like that. I think we're seeing what happened before, but in a different lens this time round. And if people don't stand up and say, I may not agree with you. I may not have the same beliefs as you, but I want to hear your voice. I want to listen to you. I want to say, I disagree with you profoundly, and this is why I disagree with you profoundly. But I'm not going to silence your opinion, or I'm not going to prevent you from coming to the college to speak because you happen to be Jewish or you happen to be Israeli. Which you're seeing in colleges, this effort now to silence some of the greatest educational voices because they happen to be Israeli, or they happen to be Jewish, or they happen to be not they following a religious view or an ethnicity that is wanted at the time because some group want to silence.
Yeah, actually, when I taught sixth grade, during that time, there was what occurred in the United States it was called the Columbine Massacre. That was about 1992 when two young men who worshipped Hitler on Hitler's birthday went out and massacred and killed at least 10 students and a teacher. And set the school up, had bombs throughout, fire bombs, and then they killed themselves. After that, one of my students, who was an 11-year-old girl from El Salvador, started reading about the Holocaust. She read 10 books about the Holocaust. She became an expert on the Holocaust, and she wrote a play dealing not just with the Holocaust, but with racism in the United States and apathy. And so, and she got half the class to perform that. We actually performed this play in front of the whole school. She got interviewed on a TV station, and it was very well written. And so when I give my talks as a Holocaust speaker myself, I use her introduction about the Holocaust. And I read it to the students because it's kind of in, of course, now when I want to talk about it, I can't find it, but it's in her own, her own words, and she, but it's. To me, I thought it was so worthwhile. Here it is. Because she connected everything. She connected the Holocaust to the KKK in the United States, to the massacre that just occurred in Chile, and to silence and not wanting to be part of understanding the world. So she says nearly 6 million Jews were killed in what historians have called the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a conflagration, a great raging fire consuming in its path all that lives. Just such a murderous fire burned for a few long years during World War II in Germany and in the countries that Germany invaded and conquered. When this Holocaust was over, nearly 1/3 of all the Jews in the world had been put to death. It started as a small form of prejudice, but many times minor forms of prejudice have a way of growing into destructive forms. In this case, it cost the lives of many people. That's how she started her introduction to her play. And to me, that shows really children can understand what's going on.
Oh, absolutely.
So well.
They're like sponges.
And just want to tell you how her play ends. And there are two students, they're playing basketball. So one student says, "What's up?" "Oh, nothing. I'm just doing some homework." "Oh, did you hear about the shooting in Colorado?" "No." "Well, two students in Columbine came to school with guns and bombs and killed 15 people. It was 15 people, and a teacher in this horrible massacre." "Oh, well, I gotta go shoot some hoops." "Hey," this is Vicky saying to Anthony, "hey, this is important. Anthony says, why should I care about something in Colorado? It's not even our state. It's not my problem.
Yeah.
Vicky says, it can happen anywhere. You need to care about other people. You need to have pride in your school. Get rid of it's not my business attitude. It is our business. When the Nazis pulled the Jews out of their homes, the German neighbors just watched and let it happen. They stood by and let 11 million people die. Then what happens is the whole cast sits on the stage and points to the audience and says, are you part of the problem or part of the solution? That's an 11-year-old girl.
But this is just extraordinary. We often underestimate the power of a child to actually educate. I mean, I fully believe they're children for a purpose. They come into the world untouched, and I actually wrote that in my book about, children come into this world and they're like blank sheets of paper, and gradually over time, somebody writes on that piece of paper and someone else writes on that piece of paper, and layers and layers and layers and layers of people's opinions are put on that child's paper of life, if you like. If you see the child as a metaphor for a piece of paper. And it's how do you actually imprint on that child positive words, positive meaning, positive events, rather than cluttering it up with awfulness and with nonsense. And I mean, there isn't a child that comes into this world hating. They'll go to anybody who'll show them kindness. They'll go to anybody who'll show them that they belong. And it's to try and help them to belong to positive groups. I interviewed a man the other day he was Muslim, and his son was murdered at 21. He was studying, and he was a pizza delivery man during his college. And 14-year-olds and an 18-year-old called for a pizza for him to deliver it, and basically they shot him dead, the 14-year-old. But he forgave the 14-year-old, and he became very good friends with the 14-year-old's grandfather, and they set up the Azam Kamisa Foundation in California to try and get gangs, youngsters away from gangs. And Tony, who killed his son, spent 4 years of a 25-year sentence in prison. He came out last year, and he has joined the foundation, working with the man whose son he killed.
Wow.
And it's just Azim is the father, and it's just to try and get children at a young age and to teach them the value of human life, the value of everyone's life, irrespective of their nationality, their race, their language, their culture, their political views. This world would be very, very boring if we were all the same and all had the same views.
Right.
And it is true for what you say. If you sit back and you just dismiss people's views without listening to them, then you're never going to learn. We're all going to be entrenched in our own side.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention about my mother, because her story is also part of my family story, how she escaped, because she was in Berlin in studying to become a nursery school teacher. And she, when she was 17, she was living in an apartment, and there were guys who were living next door. They told her, don't go out tonight. And that was Kristallnacht. And so she could hear it. She told me how she could hear all the sounds, breaking glass. And I mentioned what that meant, the Kristallnacht. And so she was able to get money. So her mother, who was a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, um, and had friends who, so they were able to get enough money and material. And so she got onto the kinder transport.
Yeah.
My mother went then to England to a school called Stotley Rough, which was run by
Quakers.
yeah, well, it was Hilda Leon. Yeah, I believe it was a Quaker house. Yes, but Hilda Leon, who was a women's movement leader from Germany, was in charge and was friends with her mother, my grandmother, and so they were able to set it up so my mother could actually send some of her clothes and things ahead of time. Unlike normally on the kinder transport, you only were allowed one suitcase, and that was it. But so she was there for 2 years. It was a boarding school, and then she started to work with Anna Freud in Anna Freud's nursery because my grandmother knew Anna Freud, worked with Anna Freud, and so my mother took care of babies and little children during the Blitz of London.
Yeah, London.
So she would take the kids down to the underground shelters. She'd have to watch them. And in 1945, at the end of the war, my mother continued to take care of children, started her own child care center. Started with about 12 children. And actually, the children that were in her group were orphans from the Theresienstadt concentration camp. And I didn't only found that out a few weeks ago. But I just want to read my poem to my mother, if it's okay.
I'd love to hear it.
Okay, it's as the glass shattered, lives were scattered. Survive is what mattered, even with souls battered. She was 17. It was time to leave. The list of what she could take, fill one suitcase, make no mistake. The boat of life to escape the strife, to begin anew with so much to do. 83 years have passed. The memories will always last. We must strive to keep alive all we have learned, all we know, and teach the world how to grow. Our words must carry weight to proclaim our fate. So let us all do our part and give our hearts to the people.
It's amazing. That's so beautiful. It's amazing, David, how you have inherited the creative and the scientific brain of both your father, your grandfather Otto, your father, and your grandmother and your mother. In many respects, but you were saying your grandmother was an artist, and
yeah,
she was also a mathematician, and your grandfather had the science brain, and so had your father, and it's amazing how it came out in you as well through the creative, the poetry, because poetry is really the creation of a picture through words. Yeah. That's really what it is. It's telling a story and painting a picture through words.
So, with Otto, just want to say one or two other things. That 4 of Otto's students won Nobel Prizes.
Wow.
That was Ochoa, Lippmann, Wald, and Luft. So, they continued what he taught them, and they went on to win Nobel Prize. So the other thing, he loved music, art, poetry, philosophy. He was really a philosopher. He actually taught science to workers in the 20s and 30s who would come and they'd have like a circle of people. And he actually he established contact with German scientists after World War II. He would never set foot on that country again, but he actually, through papers and through phone calls, he did continue talking to them. Now, even though you know, you had mentioned about how the Nazis had took over the universities. Well, there was a German scientist who took over my grandfather's lab and turned it into a poison gas manufacturing laboratory. So if you can imagine, is that a clear example of a scientist who was creating so much for the benefit of mankind in terms of medicine being changed into a death-creating laboratory?
It's just diametrically opposed to what your grandfather had set it up for.
So, I mean,
versus
I wrote a poem about my grandfather, and for this coming up to be the 100th anniversary of his receiving the Nobel Prize. And this, like I said, there's a series of lectures which people can access. Go to the University of Heidelberg website and like search for the Otto Meyerhof lecture series. And so German scientists are acknowledging everything that he did, and they want to honor him, and they're combating anti-Semitism. There are lectures about how that happened in the university and other areas. And so, and this one scientist, he gave the life story. That's what I did send you, the slides of Otto's life story. And actually the ending is, what he did is, the poem that I wrote, he read that at the conclusion of his lecture. Even though his was in German, he ended it with my poem, which was in English. And it's called Otto Meyerhof Legacy. We remember Otto Meyerhof here with his lasting memory so clear. His contributions stand out, with his legacy enduring, no doubt. He never wavered in his pursuit of knowledge so true. He laid the groundwork for the science we now do. We must never forget how he changed the world, and keep our passion for discovery and learning unfurled. Let science and progress continue to flow. Let humanity triumph over evil always show. The work of Otto Meyerhof is here for the world to share, for all of us to think, explore, discover, and dare.
They would be very proud of you. Both your father and your parents and grandparents would all be proud of the legacy that you're continuing. You know, there's many people many grandparents have been forgotten down through the centuries. Yours certainly won't be, because you'll continue it, and I presume your son will continue the legacy, and so on. And in another 100 years or 200 years, the Meyerhof name will still be as renowned as it is today. Well, David, it's been an absolute joy listening to the story of 3 generations of the Meyerhof family. And, you know, as I said earlier on, we can all but hope that we make an impact in one person's life. But in Otto's and your dad's life, they've made an impact for generations to come, if not forever, really.
Well, I appreciate so much being part of this program, and the meaning to me goes beyond my own personal gratitude. It's my family's gratitude, and it's also, I think, the scientific world and people who want to make this a better world, a world of change for humanity. And it's so important for people to never forget the past and learn that we have to forge a better future.
And we have to engage with each other, and we have to find ways of understanding each other, even when we don't want to. And to understand that what connects us all is is the fact that we're all different and yet very, very similar, in that at the center of all of us is the desire to be loved and the desire to make an impact in life. That's what we all share. Two things, three things probably: love, family, and the desire to make a difference in people's lives. So, Shindera leis an clár, that's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, Lacuna of Day. Bawalam tu galer chiacana, sonus agus gra. I wish you peace, happiness, and love. Agus gadei shiv slán. God bless, David. Shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom. I'm trying to look for this.